got the vibe. Yeah.
Okay, so I did some like deep listening to Jordan Peterson in terms of his critiques of Marxism and all that, and so I definitely had some disagreements here. And I definitely want to talk to you, Drew, about this because I know you spent a lot of time listening to Jordan Peterson. Mm-hmm. So let's see. He had a lot of points. Let's see. So one of the main issues he talks about is kind of like the idea of neo-Marxism, the merging of postmodernism and Marxism, and he talks about the idea that Marxism says that the accumulation of inequality of wealth is a flaw of capitalism. So he's talking about Marx saying that. And he says that that is incorrect. And he points to the Pareto principle, which is the idea that in any human endeavor, you know, what is it, like 30% do 70% of the
It's like 10%
or something
do
like
like
that.
80% of the work or something like that.
So when I was listening to him, he talked about how that's the fact that capitalism produces inequality is untrue because that's going to happen in any human societal relation. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things he talked about. And then, let's see. Oh, sorry.
Well, let's just talk about that.
Anyway, yeah. So that's something I really disagree with his representation of that and whether that's accurate. Because what Marx talks about, he does say that it's the accumulation of wealth is a thing in capitalism. But what he points to more specifically is that this unequal accumulation of wealth and power within a society is a result of the hierarchical structure of societal relations. So saying that, you know, in the workplace you have the manager and all the employees, and that represents the same structure as, say, lords and serfs in feudalism or masters and slaves in slavery. Yeah. And Marx points to the fact that we need to have relations that are non-hierarchical and authoritarian as the primary basis of societal relations. And so that's where the idea of, like, say, democratizing the workplace comes from.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's what Marx was arguing. And so I think that's something that really needs to be explored, is that whole idea of, you know, is it necessary to have a society where power is controlled by the few as opposed to the many, and that kind of thing. So another thing he goes into is talking about how in the 60s, he says Marxism was totally invalidated because of everything going on in, like, communist Russia and all these different things. And because it was invalidated, there was kind of like a switching of language. And this is where it gets into, like, feminism and all of that.
Yeah. Postmodernism.
Right. So what's your understanding of postmodernism, Drew?
So, postmodernism is the idea that there's no real, like, structure to anything. It's that the only structures are power structures. Right. So the idea that, like, there will be certain groups who wish to have power, and so they create kind of a system that will enforce that power, reinforce that power. And then there's, like, group dynamics, really, and, like, no one has... It's also, at bottom, there's no real truth. There's no real
no
anything...
objective reality,
exactly.
No objective morality.
There's just the...
moral relativism and all that.
Exactly. Yeah. There's just the standards that, like, are put forth by each group as, like, this is the right thing, and then if you follow it, you will end up powerful, basically.
So, the way he connects this to Marxism, it seems to me, is... So in Marx's class analysis, it's a way of analyzing history through the lens of the competing interests of those in power versus the mass of people. And saying that, you know, there's a conflict going on there because those in power are constantly trying to enact policies or various things to keep themselves in power and keep the masses out of power. Mm-hmm. So that's Marx's class analysis, essentially. And what Peterson is saying is that after Marxism essentially became not okay in the 60s and all of that,
proved to be wrong in that's like his thing is like,
right, which is something I want to also critique because he's not taking into account the mass political war that was waged on left-wing thinkers. It's not like it was a logical debate and everyone agreed that it wasn't okay. It was a purging of that whole political identity and discussion.
Totally.
I agree that that's not a fair assessment. You can't really say that it was proved that it won't work.
Well, and I think, okay, so with this whole thing that, like, even that postmodernism kind of like take that I just said is kind of like a stereotype. It's not really, because postmodernism is obviously, it's a critique of the intellectual structures that we've created.
Right.
So in that way, it's really easy to say that they don't like any kind of intellectual structures, but if you look at the postmodernist philosophers, like, and you read them, you know, they obviously believed in using some kind of structure to get out that information that maybe structures should be like contemplated. But yeah, I would say that in that same kind of idea is like Jordan stereotypes Marxism as what took place during communist Russia.
See, exactly. He only points to kind of like that state control of things and calls that Marxism.
Well,
but he does go into the psychology of like power relations and all that too.
Well, and he almost, I don't know, like I would like to look into that. I don't know about it as much as you do. I don't know about the economic system as well as you do for communism. But the idea that he once puts forth is that these were necessary transitions because it didn't happen just in Russia. It also happened in China. And it was like that for some reason when people decide to go communism, it ends up killing millions and millions and millions of people because they do it maybe in an inefficient way. But he's like, well, is that implicit in trying to change over to that system?
This is my big problem with him, is he seems to say that any alternative to capitalism equals authoritarian government control. And that Marx inherently means that. Marxism means that. Everything I was listening to seemed for him to be painting.
I don't know if he ever says anything about like capitalism being the best thing, but I do definitely think he's said that communism is not a good alternative. He definitely thinks that it's the worst.
For sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. I want to find the note. There was definitely one point where he said that. Oh yeah, here he goes. He says, "Society is flawed, but we have no better alternative to what we have." So that's what he said that.
Totally.
That there is no viable alternative to capitalism.
At least that
because we've tried them and they didn't work. Yeah. So he really is kind of equating the critique of capitalism to the experimentation of state-run society and saying that didn't work.
I think we got to be careful about that one because I would want to know what he was saying around that, also the context of that, because I feel it seems silly to me that he would say there's no alternative to what we have now.
Well, there was, and I'm sure he probably dig further into that. Yeah. That was his quote. But I mean, obviously, if you said, "Well, let's talk about hypothetical things we haven't tried yet," then maybe
he's not saying that we should stay where we are and not change anything.
That's why I would
assume from that statement.
Well, he went on to talk about how all we have is how do we reform what we have? Yeah. We shouldn't be trying to get something new.
Right.
So that is again where I would disagree with him.
Yeah, I mean, that one's difficult. He's also very Jungian. So the other
which
thing
I like about
is,
because
one of the things that Carl Jung said though is that you shouldn't try to take on other cultures. You should try to develop your own culture from where it is, because if you try to take on another culture, you basically he had the idea of there being even this evolution aspect to it, where you're literally it would be like us trying to breed CO2. It's like you don't have the equipment.
Right.
So I don't know if I would agree with that, especially with the kind of neuroscience that we've had about how the brain can adapt to different situations. But I would say that maybe it's good to think about it in the way where it's structurally all of the structures that we've created in the West and how our government is set up and stuff like that. Maybe it's really it is more important than to try to flip all of that you try to adapt it to become better.
That's what I would say too, because I think it's fundamentally more likely that you would go down that path than have a switch.
And then, I mean, you have to get into, are you talking about, flipping everything or just a core mechanism?
Well, that's why
I'm talking about.
That's why I really think I would love to see that Richard Wolff thing, because I think, because of how much what we've talked about is of it being compatible with capitalism is, I think that would be, the number one thing where it would be I don't
compatible with markets or
markets, I guess. Sorry.
Well, we do have to talk about those definitions.
Yes. Yeah. And here's something that I would say about what Jordan Peterson believes, and I'm sort of painting between the lines here a little bit, but my understanding is that he does not. So he really hates quality of outcome, right? And I think he really doesn't like state-run economy,
Right.
and so I agree with him on those points.
Me too.
And I would say the biggest critique of any, completely Marxist idea of like totally equality of outcome, which maybe, that's not exactly what Marx is advocating for,
Right.
but that's the idea of communism, right? Is that it removes incentive structures.
Definitely.
And so Jordan Peterson is essentially saying we need incentive structures or
Definitely.
nothing's going to work.
And if you're going to say that the idea of equality of outcome, we should just essentially understand that that's not okay.
Mhm.
I agree with that completely.
Yes, I think we should say that. I think we should have a floor below which no one is allowed to